Welcome to the Jedburgh podcast. I'm the creator and host, Fran Racioppi. Each episode, I speak with transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, and those dedicated to winning no matter the challenge. The Jedburgh podcast is founded in the lineage of the Special Operations Jedburgh teams of the past and is produced in partnership with Talent War Group, a management consulting and executive search firm focused on helping you optimize the people side of your business. We're sponsored by Jersey Mike Subs. Together, we share the mission of giving, making a difference in someone's life. Visit the Jedburgh Podcast, Talent War Group, and Jersey Mike Subs on the web and on all social media. A percentage of all proceeds is dedicated to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation.
Once we got him in and he said pineapple and we got him pulled through, it was then that we opened the aperture up and that 4-foot hole in the fence that UC Tanner had cut to help 2 Afghan women days earlier. We didn't even meet UC until after. We didn't even know him. But to find out that he was the guy that had cut that fence and that it would move so many hundreds of people through, what it really speaks to me is the power of human connection and relationships in a time of crisis and just how powerful that is.
A year ago, the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, officially ending the 20-year global war on terror. In many ways, it seemed that America ended the war just as quickly and chaotically as we entered it when our nation was violently attacked on September 11, 2001. We spent billions of dollars in Afghanistan. We lost 2,465 of our nation's bravest and finest service members. I lost some of my best friends. Thousands more were wounded and forever changed physically, mentally, and emotionally. We lost 13 in the final days when we were told our mission was complete, but yet we were far from done. Historians, pundits, and every American will debate for decades the events that unfolded throughout the summer of 2021. We may never find agreement on whether we failed or succeeded in Afghanistan. But what's for sure, but what's fact, is that we left people behind in Afghanistan. We left thousands who stood by our side, fought for their country, and knew nothing except an Afghanistan full of American hope for freedom and democracy. Some of these allies earned and wear the exact same Special Forces tab and Green Beret that I did. For this episode, I returned to the place where the global war on terror began on the blue sky day of September 11, 2001 in Lower Manhattan. I asked retired Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mann to join me on a balcony overlooking the Freedom Tower and the 9/11 Memorial for a conversation on the withdrawal from Afghanistan and his new book, Operation Pineapple Express. Scott answered the call last July and August when confusion and chaos descended upon the Hamid Karzai International Airport in Kabul. Scott did exactly what every long-serving Green Beret does when faced with an insurmountable task. He pumped his network. He got everyone he knew involved. He found answers and solutions when others saw obstacles, and he worked tirelessly to free the oppressed. He mastered the chaos, and he lived the motto of the Green Berets, Deo Preso Liber. Scott and I cover the story of Operation Pineapple Express, the U.S. government's decision to leave Afghanistan, the lessons learned, and where we go from here. We also discuss leading from the front and America's place as the shining city on a hill. Scott is the example of Special Forces leadership. He's an author, playwright, entrepreneur, and a warrior who's battled his own scars along his path to creating impact. Operation Pineapple Express pulled hundreds to freedom through a hole in the gate in the final days on the ground in Afghanistan. But thousands of our strongest allies still remain, and America's work is not done. My America leaves no one behind. My America leads from the front, always and no matter the challenge. Take a listen on your favorite podcast platforms. Watch the full video version of my conversation with Scott overlooking the Freedom Tower and the 9/11 Memorial on YouTube. Subscribe to us and follow at Jedburgh Podcast on all social media. And check out our website at jedburghpodcast.com. Learn more about Scott Mann at rooftopleadership.com and scottmann.com. Get a copy and read Operation Pineapple Express wherever you get your favorite books. And follow Scott on social media at Rooftop Leadership. Scott, welcome to the Jedburgh Podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Fran. Really cool to be here.
It's your book tour.
Yeah.
It's coming out tomorrow, so I'm super honored that when you came to New York, you came all the way up from Tampa and you brought the heat, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, man, you're welcome.
But tomorrow it launches.
Yeah.
And the book's Operation Pineapple Express.
Yeah.
I have it right here. I spent the last couple of days reading it. You, over the last year plus now, you've been so instrumental in this fight against Afghanistan. When you and I spoke a couple of months ago and we were talking about having you on, telling this story,
right,
there was only one place that I felt we needed to have this conversation, and that was down here at Ground Zero.
Yeah.
And I'm getting chills just talking about it and introducing it here because people who are listening to this on podcast platforms won't be able to see it. So they have to go to YouTube. They have to see it on Instagram and everything we put it on. But we have the World Trade Center behind us, the Freedom Tower, and we're looking down at the reflecting pools.
Yeah.
And this place, for so many of us, and especially for you, is where so much of our lives changed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we're going to talk about Operation Pineapple Express. We're going to talk about the impact that you've made in Afghanistan, not just in the last year to 15 months, but over the last 20 years. But it starts here at Ground Zero on September 11th, 2001, where you lost your Ranger buddy in those towers.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah. Actually, Cliff Patterson, he was killed in the Pentagon. But same day, same attack. And every time I come here, Fran, I mean, it doesn't matter if I'm just driving by or, I have to stop. I have to walk over to those reflecting pools. I have to go stand at the Horse Soldier, and it's so fresh. Even though it's been over 20 years, man, like it was, I think for all of us that fought in the war on terror, it changed our lives. It changed our families' lives. Like my son Cody, my oldest son, I have 3 boys. He was 3 years old when those towers fell, and now he's an infantry lieutenant.
It's crazy.
And it's just, I think that to me kind of summarizes what all of us gave. Some gave much more during the longest war in our history. Yeah, it was the right place to be for this, man.
Where were you on September 11th?
I was I was in 7th Group. I was in 1st Battalion. I was a captain in 7th Group, a pretty senior captain at the time. I was a commander of the headquarters support company for 1st Battalion, and we were actually on our way to Fort Pickett. We had just done a live fire with my guys, and we were going to recognize, like SF guys do, all of the wonderful people at Fort Pickett, who had made that happen. And so we were maybe, I don't know, 10 miles outside of Fayetteville, and we were listening to talk radio. I had my sergeant major my first sergeant and my weapons sergeant with me. And Donnie and Eddie, when we heard it over talk radio that there had been an attack on the World Trade Center, and we heard the play-by-play of the second plane hitting, and Donnie, career SF NCO without even being prompted, turned around in the median of I-95, and we started making a beeline back for 7th Group. And then we watched the rest of it on play on the television in our orderly room. All of us, I think, just knowing that our lives had changed forever.
Yeah. You spent 18 years in Special Forces, 23 years in the Army. You went to Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, Iraq, and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Talk about Afghanistan in terms of the evolution of that mission, because you have numerous deployments there, and I want to talk about VSO in a minute.
Yeah.
But standing up of the Afghan Special Operations Forces was a critical component of how we conducted the Afghan mission, and you were a central part of it.
Yeah, I think if you look at the evolution of our time in Afghanistan over 20 years, particularly with capacity building, you look at the Special Forces role, the broader Special Ops role, it started by working by, with, and through true indigenous clans and tribes, right? The Northern Alliance, the Pashtun tribes of the South and the East. I mean, it was old school UW, Jedburgh kind of stuff. But then around 2004, which was my first deployment to the country, Fran, that was when the Afghan National Army, the first, what they called Kandaks or battalions of the ANA stood up. And I think it's interesting that the ANA were Green Berets, representative of the first group of soldiers who trained them and put them on the assembly line. What a lot of people don't know is that U.S. Army Special Forces dissolved themselves or absolved themselves of that mission fairly early in the process, and they went to the National Guard. But when I got there, the first Afghan National Army Kandaks were rolling off the assembly line. In southern Afghanistan, we had like 2. Mm-hmm. And being a 7th Group guy, I think we felt like it was time for the host nation army to come into play and move beyond the militia approach. So my first tour of duty was actually mission commander for several operations that put the ANA 205th Corps into combat at company and battalion maneuver levels, and that was a sporty deployment. It was rough. Our big mission operation Namdong in Uruzgan province, like the first contact with the enemy, we had maybe 2 to 3 Green Berets per company, and the SF guys were magnificent. The ANA less so. Most of them broke and ran at the first crack of a round. But, over time they got better. And I don't think I think we built that army in our own image. We tried to build a Western-style army, and we never should have done that.
Yeah. We tend to do that in a lot of places.
We do, and as a result of that, it showed up in June of 2021, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But we built an army that required special platforms, that required special equipment, optics, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and very contractor-heavy. So the Afghan National Army, the Afghan National Police, less than mediocre. Even at their height. But the special operations forces that started to emerge in 2008 when the commandos first started to come into play, and then shortly behind them, Afghan Special Forces in 2010, the KKA, the NMRG, the National Mine Reduction Group, amazing tactical capabilities, and frankly, carried the bulk of the load, Fran, in keeping the Taliban and ISIS on their heels starting in 2014 when President Obama had the Afghans take the lead. So, my evolution's there with 3 rotations where I got to see a lot of change over time in that country. But I have to say that really the Afghan Special Operations community, they were good. They certainly retained the ability to keep doing what they were doing with minimal advisory oversight. And I think it's a real shame that we left that force abandoned, because I think they could have held the line.
You were big on the Village Stability Operations, VSO. You were partnered with the Afghan Special Operations Forces for a lot of this. And these Village Stability Operations were critical in Afghanistan and really changed the fight against the Taliban and ISIS. Can you define what the Village Stability Operations were and why they were so important? Yeah,
I think any of your special operations listeners, special forces, old school Green Berets will recognize this term. We were doing remote area FID, remote area foreign internal defense. I mean, really, that's what VSO was. It was modeled on the old CIDG program of Vietnam, where 5th Group, NCOs, and others worked with the Montagnards and other tribal factions in the Central Highlands specifically, before it was taken over by the General Purpose Force and then tried to mass produce, and it failed miserably. But
it's like we've seen this movie before.
I know. But as we looked at in 07, 08, I came back from a rotation, my second rotation in Afghanistan, Fran, and what I have to say is we attrited a lot of Taliban on that rotation. The commandos were starting to come up, but what I saw was, and a lot of us saw, that there were more Taliban in the rural areas of Afghanistan than when we had started in 02.
Really?
Yeah, and that concerned a lot of us, and we felt like we were losing. Like if that was what was going on, then there was a real problem here. So what we started moving towards, with the help of people like Dr. Seth Jones, Dr. Arturo Munoz, who had studied Afghanistan closely, was looking at the Zahir Shah era of Afghanistan back in the 70s, really from the 20s to the 70s, the Musahiban dynasty as it was known. And what it basically was this: Afghanistan is primarily a status society. They're tribal, they're clan-based. But the urban areas are what they call contract societies. So what you really needed was more of a relationship between the top-down central government and the outlying rural areas to stand on their own. They called it an Arbakai or a Chawalesti, and there was huge multi-decade precedent for it. So we reached out to a lot of the CIDG veterans like Dave Phillips and others who understood this program, and we wrote a methodology and put in place of just getting back to our roots. There was nothing super innovative or new about it. We called it Village Stability Operations, but in reality, it was remote area FID. And frankly, I'll end on this, it's what we should have been doing after OEF 1. We should have gone right into that instead of this big footprint, top-down, I'm from the government, how do you like me so far stuff.
Yeah, but one of the keys to this is patience, though.
It is.
You have to have a tremendous amount of patience. And we saw this in Afghanistan. We saw this in Iraq, where we implement these types of plans and programs. We start doing it, and then we don't even wait for it to become effective, because we're saying, well, why isn't it effective yet? It was supposed to automatically start. And it's like, no, relationships take time.
Absolutely.
Trust takes time.
Yeah, and again, I go back to, what I love about the title of this podcast. The Jedburghs understood that.
Yeah.
They didn't come out until the war was over. And we said up front, because the 5th Group guys from Vietnam were very, very adamant about this, because they learned when it was overloved by the conventional force in the Vietnam War, was this is going to be a multi-decade endeavor. This is going to be a long game, and you need to make sure that the leadership's on that. And we were really adamant about that, and we were given assurances way up the line that this was going to be the long game, that SF would continue to do a version of this mission. And this mission entailed really helping local, primarily Pashtuns, because they are tribal, whereas Tajiks, Uzbeks are less tribal, Hazaras less tribal. And frankly, those ethnicities are more open to a contract-style government, a top-down. But the rural Pashtuns are more egalitarian, and this Arbakai concept of defending their own communities, they're very open to it. And so that was the deal, was we would move into these communities like a modern Magnificent Seven and live there, work by, with, and through, and help them stand up on their own. And then ultimately, in 2010, we even had Afghan Special Forces teams coming in to live with us and do the same kind of work. And then you had the commandos in reserve as your Mike force. It was a really effective approach. It was so effective that even Osama bin Laden put out a hit on Major Jim Gant for the impacts that he was having on the Pakistan border.
Yeah, and when you talk about the Afghan Special Forces, the commandos, some of these guys, including one of the central, I won't call it characters, one of the central individuals in Operation Pineapple Express, the catalyst for it, these guys, some of them were trained in the Q course.
Absolutely.
And earned the same beret, the same tab that you and I wear.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of us had problems with when all this happened, was that we felt like, okay, I understand that there's been a declaration that we're getting out of there. I understand that our partner force, I don't understand that our partner force is getting left behind, but we have people in our regiment. They are part of our regiment who are in Afghanistan right now. Are you even tracking them? Do you know where they are? And I have to tell you, we asked this question to the senior leadership at Special Warfare Center, and my assessment was they weren't tracking that.
Well, I've been fortunate in the last year and a half on this podcast to talk to some very, very influential people, including Chris Miller, who was the Secretary of Defense, acting Secretary of Defense under Trump, and he was on our 9/11 episode last year, and he talked about just the outrage that he felt, and he was one of the first in 2001. Yeah. He said his claim to fame is that he may have been the last guy of the first in who got to say they were the first in. And then I had General McChrystal on. Yeah. And General McChrystal and I talked about Afghanistan at length, where he said whether or not he agrees with the president's decision to have really pulled the Band-Aid off. He believed that decision was courageous in the sense that he made the decision to do it. However, there was a lot that could have been changed in the execution of it.
I believe Stan McChrystal and I will agree to disagree on that one.
I think so too. That's okay. We tell all sides on this podcast. That's what I love about it.
Yeah, for sure.
Every good story starts with this first sentence that says, "No shit, there I was, minding my own business."
Absolutely. Every Green Beret story, for sure.
Oh, definitely. You retired a few years ago. You started Rooftop Leadership to build high-performing teams and leaders. You started the Hero's Journey, working with transitioning veterans and addressing the struggles they face. You had a good life in Tampa.
Yeah.
You're with your wife, Monty, who's here, sitting behind us.
Right behind you.
Kids are going off to college. You got the last one before you're an empty nester. And then you get a text from your Afghan brother-in-arms, Nazem.
Yeah.
And it's June 2021.
Right.
What does it say?
I'll paraphrase it, but it was basically, brother, everything is falling apart, and I don't know what to do. He, at the time, the first couple of texts we got from him, he was in Jedburgh, which is up close to his birthplace, actually, on the northern border of Afghanistan, and he was a contractor at this point. And he couldn't get out of there.
At the power plant.
At the power plant. And the Taliban were texting him. They were telling him they knew where he was. He ultimately got out of there, and then by June, he was, late June, I believe, he had moved into Kabul in his uncle's house, and he was hiding out in his uncle's house, like Anne Frank. And he was giving me a play-by-play, basically, on Signal. He was saying, Kapisa province has just fallen, Herat has just fallen, and it was so foreboding to get these play-by-plays from him, because he goes, I think the whole thing flips in a month. And he was like 2 days off.
Well, there were some critical things that were happening in June. I mean, Taliban seizing control of provinces. You have the U.S., all sorts of officials in the U.S. government who aren't accepting it or aren't acknowledging it.
Yeah.
We're moving forward with this shutdown. You get the contractors who get pulled out. You reference the KKA. They're gone. SOF's being targeted. President Biden's staff rumored to have been dismissing President Ghani's request for support as a wish list, as you point out in the book.
Yeah.
But the Taliban is actually using a method to gain control of these provinces that you referenced as actually was pretty profound and something that, we actually might want to use in our playbook.
I think any special operator, particularly those who work by, with, and through indigenous populations, would look at the way the Taliban took Kabul and you have to respect it. You have to just shake your head and go, wow. But their ability to move so rapidly and actually just psyop the hell out of us. Mm-hmm. I mean, they were sending specific targeted texts to key leaders in such a way that it was overwhelming to them psychologically, and they were just melding into the population, laying their weapons down in droves. And it was for the most part, a bloodless overthrow of the country. Now, did we enable that? Yeah, we absolutely did. We made policy decisions along the way that were not only uninformed, they were reckless. And one of them you just alluded to was the removal of the contract support from the very army who we had built to rely on contractors. Now, you explain that one to me. That makes no sense. If we're going to ask them to hold the line unilaterally and to keep the Taliban off bay, they have to have precision fires. They have to have intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. They have to have medevac. They have to be able to lift the commandos in and off these targets surgically. Yet all the contractors are gone to keep those platforms running. The fix was in. And in fact, we interviewed Mohib, the Minister of Defense, and he said he knew that's when it was over, when the contractors were pulled.
Move forward to July. We make another decision to close Bagram Air Base.
Yeah.
Now there's no air. Not in addition to the contractors, there's no air, there's no medevac, there's no field hospital, there's no ammo, but we've now established a choke point at the Hamid Karzai International Airport.
Right.
This will be reviewed for decades to come.
Right.
I have no doubt about that. And is seen by many as one of the largest strategic military blunders of all time. And,
right.
People have quoted that. You also cited a Pentagon report that said, and I found this to be very interesting. Actually, I didn't know it. And when I read it, I looked to my wife and was like, I didn't know this. You got to listen to this. And I read it, and it said that a sponsored government, in quotes, sponsored, has never survived our withdrawal. And the longest sponsored government that ever survived was 36 months.
That's right. And the Pentagon commissioned that survey on the front end of this departure and shared that at the highest level.
But so all of these warning signs from history
right.
are on the wall.
Right.
We have people on the ground telling us this. And then on August 15th, President Ghani leaves Afghanistan.
Yeah.
In your assessment, what is going on in the minds of our leadership at this point?
I've really tried to get my head around that, Fran, and there's different levels and different ways, I suspect, to think about it. I do believe that President Trump and President Biden both wanted out of Afghanistan completely. I think that both of them wanted out of there with no troops behind. I agree with General McKenzie in his assessment of that. He unequivocally stated that most recently. I guess he's on the stump now talking about his position on this. One of the things I would have loved to have seen, and I think when I interviewed all of the special operators from our community that I interviewed for the book, and it was dozens, to the man and to the woman, almost every one of them said, "Where were the generals? Where were the generals this time last year? Why didn't someone just throw their stars on the table and say, not on my watch? Yeah. This is morally, it's wrong to leave a partner force like this, wholesale abandonment." But there was none of that. Now you're starting to see some of these generals come out now, a year later, and say, this is where I stood on it. I said this in private to the president. But I think I can't pretend to know what President Biden and others were thinking, although I do think President Biden has made it pretty clear how he's felt about the Afghan populace, dating back to his opinion on the Vietnamese when he left there as a senator. But I think for our general officers and our flag officers and our senior enlisted advisors, I think our community, a lot of them who are hurting over this, really wonder where they were in terms of taking a stand on this, at least at some public space level, particularly the former admirals and generals that could have.
Let's fast forward to August, mid-August. You're speaking again with Nazem, and he sends you a quote. And and he says to you, and I'm quoting it here, "I'm not afraid to die, but I don't want to die alone."
Yeah.
And this becomes your why.
It really did. I mean, for me, at the time, I didn't want to get involved in the Afghanistan problem again. I retired in 2013. I had a great run, almost 23 years in the Army. And I have to say that when I saw what was going, we left the VSO program. We left those villagers in a lurch. My play is even about this. And we talk about how we, to me, it was foreboding for what was coming. We left those villagers on their own. Yeah. We walked away from them. And that was enough to cause me to retire. I hung it up. I'd been selected for a battalion command 3 times, actually. Turned all 3 down because I just didn't want to be a part of this anymore. I saw where this was going. I felt like it was a careerist move. And so I stepped back. So I had avoided the whole Afghanistan issue, Fran, for 10 years. I'd focused on restoration, healing, storytelling, looking at those aspects of my life to make sense of what I was doing. And then to get back involved in Afghanistan, I had no interest in that. And exactly what, I wasn't exactly a top draft pick either. I mean, a 53-year-old storyteller that's writing a play is not who I would call if I needed extraction. You know what I mean? I mean, I had some experience in SF, but I'm not the guy you probably got Delta sitting in the hangar.
Yeah.
Maybe they're the guys.
Who never got spun up.
Right. No, in fact, I got a call during all this from Kamala Harris's special advisor asking Pineapple to get their favorite Afghan out. And I'm like, are you kidding me? What planet does this happen on when you have a squadron of the best premier CT force on the planet and you're not letting them leave, and you're calling a retired dude to work his Signal app to get your Afghan? It made no sense. But this was where we found ourselves. And with Nizam, honestly, it just, to me, there was everything about my time in Afghanistan hinged on whether he lived or died at that point. That's what it came down to, was this man, this young man who has given so much to us, who was shot through the face defending Americans, went to RQ course. He was
That's an incredible part of the story, by the way. Being shot in the through the cheek.
Through the cheek, and was back in the fight in 2 weeks. He just said, as long as an Afghan dentist doesn't fix my mouth, I'll go back to the fight. And Mullah Mike, the captain, made sure of that, and he was back in the fight 2 weeks later. But we
got Blackhawks right behind you right now.
Wow. That's amazing.
Super fitting. Just crossing the Hudson right here. So I gotta throw that out there, and sorry to interrupt.
It's all good. I'm glad you did.
We have to embrace this moment here, sitting on this balcony.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it really is. And every time I hear those things, it kind of takes me back. But I don't know. It all hinged on whether he lived or died for me at that point, and I didn't, frankly, feel that I thought he was a dead man walking.
Yeah. In this period of time now, coming into the last couple of weeks of August, there's now this run on the airport because everything's been centralized. Can you talk for a minute about the conditions at the gates? Because this issue, as we were talking with the close of Bagram, now centralized everything into the airport. Because we had been operating out of there so long, we channelized, for good reasons, in the whole 20 years we were there, we channelized a lot of traffic through there so we could control it. All of which then became difficult operating environments for us to handle this extraction issue. But we also created a mess for our NATO allies.
Yes, we did.
And a situation where we look at it through the lens so often of how the U.S. had allies that they were trying to get out. But what a lot of people have to remember is that the falling of these towers was the first time and only time in history that NATO Article 5 has been invoked.
Right.
And an attack on one is an attack on all.
Right.
And so all of NATO descended on Afghanistan.
And they bled.
And stayed there.
And they bled.
1,400, you gave me, I had the number. Over 1,400 have been lost to NATO forces.
Yeah, and they bled. They bled for what happened in this city and in Washington, D.C. and in that Pennsylvania field. And, one of the things I talk about in the book is And kind of my theme, Fran, as I wrote this book, because my focus was I wanted to possibly tell stories in such a way that people would care a bit more about our Afghan partners and our veterans and understand why Afghanistan matters so much. And, one of the questions, or two questions that I asked as prevailing questions in the book were, what does a promise mean to you, and how far would you go to honor it? Mm-hmm. And, when I look at how our leaders thought about the promise they made to their NATO partners, after how they answered their promise to us, it's egregious. And how far would you go to honor it? Not far, right? Not far at all. And I think it's really telling at a senior leadership level along political, diplomatic, and military lines of where we sit as a society on our ability to honor a promise.
The elements of national power.
That's right. But yet at the veteran level, at the street level, you had this, highly damaged population roll back into the fray and ruck up and do what needed to be done, plus our active duty components, both on the ground and virtual. I mean, they showed us what leadership really looked like, even though the senior leaders were completely clueless on what it means to honor a promise. But thinking about the NATO impact and the impact to our Afghan partners, my concern is that we have a systemic history of abandonment that goes from the Vietnam Montagnards to the Syrian Kurds, to the Iraqi police and military, and now our Afghan partners. What country in their right mind would seriously partner with us if we had to really go shoulder to shoulder right now? I don't think very many.
On August 19th, you send Nazem to the airport.
Yeah.
And you've started coordinating with people on the inside. This becomes now the proof of concept as he's able to get through this gate.
Yeah.
And the gate's cut by a Finnish
special
envoy. So now this whole Operation Pineapple, if you could talk about kind of that part of it, how this getting him through that gate initially gave you the proof of concept.
So, and by the way, just a lot of luck and comedy of errors as we moved him through, because honestly, I didn't want to move him at that time. When I made the decision to get back involved again, I called a couple of buddies who were still on active duty who had fought with Nazem when we were doing VSO. I called Mike Waltz, and he got me connected to one of his staffers, and then a couple of other Washington insiders, and that was it. And honestly, we were still formulating the plan when Mike Penn, Mullah Mike, came to me, who had commanded Nazem in combat, and he said, "Scott, we got to send him now, like right now." And I was really kind of pissed. I said, "Dude, we don't even have a plan. He's going to get burned in the broad daylight. He's going to compromise the safe house. It's a one-shot deal if we do that." He said, "I know, but if we don't, the Taliban are going to have that." He goes, "I have a feeling the Taliban are going to secure that base, and if we don't get him in there in front of that, he's never going to get through."
So he had to be on the inside before they set up.
And Mike's gut was always, anytime he came to me with something like that, I knew he was right. I didn't like it. But so we rolled Nazem out really hastily, and we were able to get him in an indigenous cab that was pretty well concealed. But the bottom line is, a lot of that Nazem needs to take credit for, because he maneuvered himself brilliantly. But what I think we were able to do was to be his eyes and ears, and then to reach across the gate and get him a way in. Now, to your point, once we got him in and he said pineapple and we got him pulled through, it was then that we opened the aperture up, and that 4-foot hole in the fence that UC Tanner had cut to help 2 Afghan women days earlier. We didn't even meet UC until after. We didn't even know him. But to find out that he was the guy that had cut that fence and that it would move so many hundreds of people through, what it really speaks to me is the power of human connection and relationships in a time of crisis, and just how powerful that is.
Talk about the choices that some of our Afghan partners had to make. And I've been speaking now for a bit over a year. There was a group of senior Afghan officials who had been airlifted out, and because they were being persecuted in the early days, and they had been taken immediately to the airport. And I've been speaking with them on and off for the last year or so, because they left without their families. And we look at that, and I remember looking at that actually, honestly, until I read the book, and saying, like, how could you leave your family? How could you do that?
Yeah.
And it's hard in our position, it's hard to question that, right? Because you're not there and you're not going through what they're going through. But the book tells a bunch of these stories, a number of them, about how several had to make the decision of, stay and die with my family, or leave and hope that they stay alive.
Yeah. So I'll talk about three choices that to me stand out in the book that are indicative of the Afghan psyche and the Afghan mindset. And I think hopefully we'll put to rest some of these BS narratives that the Afghans didn't fight, that they weren't willing to stand up, because a lot of them did and still are. One of them is the way the Afghan commandos and special ops felt about service. When Nizam was burning all of his, we told him to burn everything. Burn everything, dude. Take a picture of it first, send it to us. We'll store it on the cloud. Burn the rest so you don't get compromised when you go through checkpoints. Good, just standard tradecraft, right?
Right.
Well, he's out there burning everything, and he looks at his SF tab that he got at Bragg, and he looks at his certificate, and he can't do it. So he stuffs it in the bottom of his gym
wouldn't be
bag.
able to do it.
Right. Well, it turns out neither was Bashir, neither was Basira, neither was Azizullah. Every single one of these special operators went through these checkpoints with their mementos in their bags. They were not willing. They were willing to endure beatings, even death, than leave those behind.
Yeah.
I think that, to me, speaks volumes about the quality of these warriors. Number two is Bashir going to the airport without his family. You know, his wife had basically gone into labor the first day when they had gone through. The crowds were tens of thousands, man. UC Tanner called it the raft of the Medusa after the painting in the Louvre, where a raft of castaways was cut away from a ship and they resorted to cannibalism and violence. And he said that's what it reminded him of, you know, mothers holding their babies up in the air with pink cheeks, and they were purple because of all the tear gas that they were inhaling, and they were trying to hold them above the clouds of tear gas, you know, to give you an idea of just how terrible the crowds were.
That's like biblical.
Oh, it was, and UC said, like, you could hear the babies when they would scream. They had been out in there in the crowd for so long they couldn't make a sound. All you would see were these faces of these little babies that couldn't even make a sound, but yet they were wailing and getting crushed underfoot. It was horrific. And so Bashir went back to his home that first day. His wife was starting to demonstrate labor pains, and James with the hat said to him, I can get you out of here. I can take care of your family, but I can't take care of you. You know, I can't promise your safety, and if they get you, they're going to get them. I'll get them to you, I promise. And so Bashir made the run. You know, they talked him into it. He went through, and then his family was moved overland to a third country. I'm going to leave the country out.
Sure.
They're still there. You know, Bashir is a security guard at a Texas grocery store. The baby girl he's never seen and his 5 other little kids and his wife are still at a safe house in this third country because we can't get them lifted out. We can't get them out of there.
Why?
Well, the State Department was working with us to some degree, but honestly, the baby girl, we can't get her a passport because she was born after the passport agency collapsed.
Right.
So we're trying to get a passport through, you know, the Taliban, and she can't leave without it. They won't let her leave without it, which is crazy to me, but even though they're approved to leave. So, you know, that family's been there a year. Guess who's paying for all of that? Bashir and donors. The government's not paying for any of that. And this guy went to our Q course. He's part of our regiment. And this is just one of many. And then the final choice was Minister Hasina Safi, the Minister of Women's Affairs, the most hunted woman in Afghanistan. She's the one who stood up for women's rights in that country. The State Department didn't evacuate her. No government agencies evacuated her, even though they knew she was on the run. She ended up coming through the sewage canal and got pulled through that 4-foot hole in the fence with her family by a first sergeant in the 82nd Airborne. Right, and a former ambassador who was her shepherd. She had to go through a sewage canal, the Minister of Women's Affairs, to get out of that country. And I think it's a metaphor for what happened to women's rights in that country when Kabul fell.
I interviewed a few weeks ago a guy by the name of Eric McNulty.
Okay.
He co-wrote a book called You're It. It's about crisis leadership. And he is he teaches at the National Preparedness Leadership Institute at Harvard University. The concept of You're It is, as leaders, we don't always get to pick when it's our time to lead in crisis.
Yeah.
Sometimes we're in the right position. Sometimes we get the phone call. It's out of the blue. Sometimes we're the last man standing. It doesn't matter. But when you're it, you've got a choice to make. And now what you do from that moment on is a test of your preparedness, your character, and how you've prepared to be in this leadership position. August 20th, you mentioned James with the hat. He calls you and he says, Scott, the cavalry's not coming. We need a leader or it won't work. I read this quote and I immediately thought of my conversation with Eric and I said, you're it. Scott was it. What is going through your head? You mentioned that you didn't want to get back into it, but now you've realized that there is no choice. You are the guy.
I felt way out over my skis. I felt like I was woefully underqualified to do what was at stake. I felt like this was a massive governmental problem. I kept thinking, where's special operations? Like, where are the senior leaders in special operations reaching out to these volunteer groups saying, hey, give us your manifest so that we can get these guys to ground or we can get them out of the country? But there was none of that. And I just kept thinking, surely they're coming. And then at some point when that call from James came, I just remember walking outside and just saying to myself, nobody's coming, man. Nobody's coming. Like, this is it. And my dad was a huge, huge help to me in that moment because I think he saw that I was really, really wavering on what to do. And he said to me, you'll never, ever get over this if you don't do what you're supposed to do right now. And he was right.
You said the Pineapple Plan had few ambiguities. It was tactical and could be executed with precision in a chaotic environment. This whole plan hinged on not only you and the other special operations people and volunteers.
Yes,
for Operation Pineapple Express,
including active duty guys.
But the two guys on the ground were an 82nd Airborne captain and first sergeant.
Yep.
And you've mentioned numerous times, where were the generals? Where were the senior leaders? Where were the people?
Right.
On the ground there, you had probably close to 5 or 6 stars of folks
for sure.
running around there, in various capacities. These were the two guys who took a stand.
Yep.
And did something about it. Why?
And there was a diplomat named JP who did the same thing, who took a stand, former Green Beret. I think at the end of the day, and they weren't the only ones. There were others who did. I chronicled those guys in the story because I saw them the most. But in talking to the other groups like Dunkirk and Moral Compass and Team 11, they saw similar things. I have to believe that at the end of the day, that this was an immoral act, right? Partner abandonment is something as special operators and really as combat soldiers fighting in Afghanistan or any other by, with, and through place. Even if you're a conventional warrior, you know what partner abandonment looks like. Yeah. And I think that they knew and they couldn't live with it. They just couldn't stand for that. Now, they had a mission to do, like John and Jesse will tell you that their primary responsibility was NEO security. They told us that. But John told me after the fact in the interviews was, I felt like we could do more. I felt like we had the autonomy. We were within the commander's intent. Jesse, I asked him, the first sergeant, and he said, my dad always taught me that there's somebody worse off than you. And I lost him way too young, and I've always tried to just make him proud, and this was a chance to do that. And I thought, my God, man, where do we find people like that? But really all of Charlie Company was that way. A lot of the Marines were that way. All I can say, Fran, is I believe that they saw it for what it was, and they were not willing to deal with that on face value. They felt like they needed to do more.
I'd have given those guys medals as their commander. What happened to him?
I don't think they got anything. I mean, I have to give it to Chris Donahue. He's the only general that went on the record with me.
Yeah.
Seriously. And I asked all of them. Not one went on the record with me. Some just refused to talk to me. And I told him, I said, look, I'm talking to a lot of your former guys, and they're asking where you are. Would love to hear from you. Crickets. But Donahue went on the record with me in his office. He was very candid, very honest, and then gave me permission to talk to Jesse and John openly and let them be on there. I thought that was pretty damn cool.
Yeah, that's great.
And I just have to throw it out to him for that. And honestly, those guys did not get recognition in my assessment from the chain of command, and they should have. What they did, both in terms of the number of people they pulled through, hundreds that they pulled through, literally pulled through that 4-foot hole in the fence, processed and moved out of there. They saved I don't know how many lives, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Minister of Women's Affairs. but also their response to the explosion.
Yeah.
You know, the way that they responded to the explosion, and there were a lot of others who did so as well, but I don't think those guys were properly recognized for what they did.
Let's talk about August 26th, 5:38, Kabul time. Masses of passengers, as you call them, on Pineapple Express. Chaos at Abbey Gate. Reports of an impending attack and the ISIS case focus on potentially trying to disrupt this withdrawal. Call it exposure risk.
Yeah.
We've been there for so long,
Yeah.
at some point it's starting to get burned. 13 U.S. service members were killed, hundreds of Afghans killed, many more wounded. These 13 were the last to die in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
What do you feel? Because I was sick.
Yeah, it's hard to put it into words, even now. You know, when that bomb went off, I knew that there were going to be deaths. There was just so much exposure. I mean, on the one hand, I feel like they were so overtly exposed, but then on the other hand, when I did the interviews and I talked to people, so many of them were going to pull people into the very end. They were just going to do that. They weren't going to stop. And talking to the Afghan commandos, the NMRG, who went out to try to find the young girls that we were trying to connect with, we lost NMRG, and they that's just how they operated. They were going to go find those girls. I choose to believe that those 13 who fell and the wounded from that day really showed us the level of sacrifice and contribution that so many of our warriors gave in Afghanistan. I don't believe it was for nothing. I just don't. I believe that's a nihilist view. I don't subscribe to that. You know, I look at the number of Afghans, 8 million, who went to school. I don't think we've heard the last of them yet. I don't think we've heard the last of these young men and women who lived under relative freedom for 20 years. I don't think they're done. I think they're coming. And I think they'll do it on their terms this time. I choose to believe that. And I believe that a lot of great contributions in this country will come from the Afghan commandos, the interpreters, their children that made it here, and those Marines, that Navy corpsman, Ryan Knoss, all of them who held the line till the very end and pulled people through. Their legacy will live in these Afghans, our allies that made it here, because of their courage, and I think the country will be better for it, and I really do believe that.
Let's talk about what it all means. You laid out in the epilogue of the book a number of lessons, if you will, that we can take away.
Yeah.
And the first one is that the people involved had different perspectives. After the withdrawal was complete, you were invited by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, to the Pentagon, and you said, quote, according to him, the Pentagon had not failed, but instead snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. To claim victory belies the purpose of the airlift in the first place. The thousands left behind who continue to face that violence every day simply do not support any claims to success. You also note that no U.S. government official has accepted what was to be, including the President, the Secretary of State, U.S. Special Envoy to Afghanistan. They all dismissed the claims that the Afghan army would collapse quickly, and you've called it political theater. Why was this their perspective?
This is where I feel like careerism has taken over. It's taken over the political realm, it's taken over the diplomatic realm, and it's taken over the military senior leadership realm. The preservation of one's career over the realities on the ground, over what was a moral act, immoral act. The wholesale abandonment of a 12-year partner force, right? And to call it the greatest airlift in American history when less than 1% of the people were even special immigration visa holders or Afghan special operators, it's just a false narrative, you know? And I heard it parroted so much, Fran, when I would go to D.C. by leaders who I'm like, wait a minute, you do know, like, I served under you for decades, right? You do know that. But yet it was coming across to me like so much of a party line. And I'm telling you, there are so many in our community right now who are devastated by this, devastated by the silence of our senior leaders, that we have a lot of work to do if we're going to regain the trust of our NCOs and officers. I think the retention and recruiting problems you see right now, I think the fact that the United States opinion of the military dropping from 70% to 56%, 11 of those points after Afghanistan, it's all indicative of this lack of trust in the senior leaders. And it all goes back to careerism. No one was willing to, you hear some general officers and diplomats now that they're away from the uniform talking about what they did or would have done. But where were they a year ago? Like, you had 30 plus years in the military. Why not make a stand for the people who served you faithfully for 2 decades and demonstrate by your deeds that this is an immoral act? And the answer I keep getting back is, well, you can't do that. If every general officer did that, then we would not be able to execute the orders of the United States, political apparatus. And my answer is, not one did it. And the question I keep getting from all of our guys that I interviewed is, where were they?
Let's talk about a risk to national security. You said America's broken promises are a risk to national security. The wholesale abandonment of Afghanistan casts serious doubt on the U.S.'s willingness to honor its promises to its allies. We talked a bit about this, but with the global war on terror officially over, I don't think the war on terror. I don't think is never going to end.
Right.
And anyone who thinks, and I will take a stand on anyone who thinks that terrorism is over because we closed the chapter book on the global war on terror is out of their mind.
That's a deluded view.
There are people who are trying to fall this tower.
Absolutely, it's already
okay.
Yeah.
And and that we have to be conscious of that absolutely every single day. But we have put a lot of focus now recently on what we're calling this near peer conflict.
Yep.
Okay, Russia, China, those who have the ability in terms of weaponry, people, right, who could actually combat us. Partnership with other nations will continue to be the only way to protect ourselves. Can you talk more about these broken promises? We talked about it with respect to NATO, but can we go back? Like, we still have to put Green Berets on the ground in Africa, in South America, even in Europe. We have a war in Europe that we haven't seen since World War II.
Right.
And it's as horrific, if not worse. And we still have to put guys on the ground who have to sit across, guys we know, who have to sit across from someone and say, you can trust me.
Right. And so let's unpack that. So at a couple of levels, first of all, this was my point, Fran, about the senior officers. Particularly in the book, I'm really hard on the special operations community, and I'm hardest on the special forces senior leadership because of what you just said. We are the premier experts on by, with, and through. When the nation needs a partnership approach, they turn to U.S. Army Green Berets. And they expect us to be able to walk into any crappy environment and leverage relationships on behalf of the nation. And anybody who is trained in social capital, rapport building, knows you build trust when risk is low, you leverage it when risk is high. Well, we have burned all of our social capital, not just with the Afghan partners, but across the country. And what bothers me is that if you look at Special Forces Command, look at U.S. Army Special Ops Command, SOCOM, SWCC, no one's talking about this. There's been no after-action reviews on what is the impact on the indigenous approach. Instead, what we have, for example, at SF Command, is a podcast called The Indigenous Approach. And it's all about how we work by, with, and through, as if this never happened. To me, every podcast episode ought to be about how the hell do we overcome this? How do we put our Green Berets in a position where they can actually build social capital again? To pretend like this didn't happen is actually setting us up for disaster. So that's in-house. But then when you look at like just the national security implications, you brought up near peer. Last time I checked, the Chinese embassy, the Russian embassy, the Iranian embassy, the Pak embassy are still open in Kabul. We walked away from the near peer threat in the very country that has always been the great game. Like, we took ourselves out of the fight completely. And now you run the risk of commandos, Afghan special forces being co-opted. And then the final piece of this is, I was talking to Lieutenant General Sami Sadat, the last commander of the Afghan SOF, who, by the way, I think is probably going to lead a resistance there. But he said, and he's got guys really well placed on the ground, Al-Qaeda is completely reconstituted. They have foreign fighters in country right now in Afghanistan, from northern Africa to Southeast Asia, training on former Afghan National Army bases in the open.
On our equipment.
On our gear. Zawahiri has been completely replaced by the chief of ops, a far more competent, capable individual. And so we are looking at a resurgence of not just ISIS, but Al-Qaeda in an unfettered sanctuary with no partner force on the ground and no intelligence network to speak of that could have. The only people holding it together right now are these volunteers, these veteran groups that are keeping it together with duct tape and baling wire.
Let me go a little deeper on that for a second, because I wanted to talk about this concept of over-the-horizon strike capabilities. It reminds me of this concept we had under the Obama administration called lead from behind.
Yeah.
I believe this concept goes against everything we were taught as Green Berets. You have to know, what is the number one soft, imperative is know your operational environment. Well,
that's right.
Behind look cool. That's number one. But second is know your operational environment. But ground knowledge matters more than anything. The relationships we build. We talked about VSO, the send me mantra.
Yeah.
If someone's got to go, send me.
Right.
Many have said, and I tend to agree with, that what if we had just, at minimum, left some sort of strike package in Afghanistan? Because at least the presence was a check on the near peers, on Iran. There was a base there that we could, at the very least, conduct other operations in the region off of. But as you've said, we've lost all foothold now. And now everything is this over the horizon. We got to fly planes, thousands and thousands of miles to be able to do anything. Can you lead from behind? And what is the risk of this over the horizon mentality?
Well, let's bring it back to this brand new tower that sits behind us here. It wasn't here 20 years ago. There were two towers here 20 years ago. And they fell because over the horizon targeting failed. And
literally
it failed
missed.
miserably. They missed bin Laden with over the horizon platform-based attacks, and they had no substantive intelligence, even though there were plenty of indicators, but there was no ground presence to speak of that allowed us to intervene on the attack that changed our life forever on 9/11/2001. So to me, how we can even take this on as a doctrine, and then you see the strike that killed the 10 innocent people in Kabul, and yeah, we got Zawahiri, but my goodness, he was standing on a wealthy building in a wealthy neighborhood drinking tea in the wide open. And it wasn't even that much of a player. To think that after what happened here and what happened in D.C. is now an acceptable methodology to do over-the-horizon targeting and to abandon a partner force and an intel ground network that we bled for and our friends died for 20 years. It's unconscionable. And the final thing is, let's just say, I'll ask you this. Let's say there's another attack in this city 3 years from now by Al-Qaeda, a reconstituted Al-Qaeda, that makes that one pale in comparison. And out of those smoldering ruins, you're going to have America's response. And it really probably won't even matter who's in power, because the people will demand it. The yellow ribbons will come out, the flags will come out on the porches, the Budweiser commercials will kick, the country songs, and we'll load up our kids and they'll go over to Afghanistan. Except this time, they're going to be facing a commando, an Afghan Special Forces, an Afghan KKA who was completely abandoned. And I just wonder how receptive they're going to be to our young men and women landing in that country again. I can't think it's going to be very good.
Well, you can go back to the Kurds.
Yeah. Yeah.
We did it to them.
Yeah.
And we've struggled with building rapport with them.
And it's a systemic problem. Like, this goes all the way back to, we interviewed a guy, Pineapple interviewed a guy named George who lives in Fayetteville, North Carolina. He evacuates people as well. He's a former Green Beret. He's evacuating Montagnards, and he's been doing it for 54 years. 54 years. He's brought thousands of Montagnards to Fayetteville, where he settles them on tribal lands on a farm. And it's like, my God, like how can we continue to do this and not learn, at least as a regiment, at least as a special operations community, we should be doing hard internal reviews right now. But the word I'm getting from people inside the building at USASOC and SF Command, you bring up Afghanistan, it's a good way to shorten your career.
Wow. What happens is the partner force looks at you, they nod their head when you show back up, and they say, I'm just going to take everything that they'll give me in terms of money and resources and equipment, and I'll generally do what they ask me, but I won't try very hard because eventually they're going to leave me again.
Exactly. And here's the thing, Fran, is that like Will Lyles, one of our shepherds, lost both legs in Afghanistan. He walked away from his C-suite executive job the minute this all happened to save the interpreter who saved him on the battlefield. And if people think that maybe I'm ranting right now and raging on generals and admirals, I'm simply reflecting what I heard in dozens and dozens and dozens of interviews. And here's what I would say to anybody listening to this that has access and placement to our senior leadership. According to a recent survey, 73% of veterans feel betrayed, 67% feel humiliated. There's been an 81% increase on the VA hotline in terms of mental duress, yet no mention of Afghanistan on the VA website. And to turn the page on this thing and pretend like it didn't happen, not address this moral injury, not address the impact of this thing, the systemic abandonment problem that we have, we have a dissonance of trust between the leaders and the led that is going to be a national security threat in itself if we don't get this fixed.
What you're talking about is this moral injury, which is a concept that you brought up, and you defined moral injury as the psychological consequence of a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. Many in the last year have said, although we may have had a moral obligation to our Afghan partners, there was no legal obligation. How does that sit with you?
How does it sit with you?
It doesn't sit with me.
Yeah, I mean,
it's very simple.
I think anyone who worked with partner forces or just a partner on the battlefield, to leave them in the way that we left them, I don't know how you could live with that. I've interviewed all kinds of fifth group guys from Vietnam who worked with the Montagnards, and to this day they openly weep when they talk about their Montagnard partners. And I was just talking with a guy named Donnie, who was one of our shepherds, and he said to me, and I think this is in the book, that if he had known, this guy's an iconic fifth group NCO, and he said that if he had known then what he knows now about how we would have treated our partner force, he would never have joined SF after those towers fell back here on 9/11. He never would have joined, and he said, my son is showing interest in the Army. I'm going to do everything I can to stop him. And to me, it's like, how in God's name can we take these amazing veterans who gave us so much? How can we look at our active duty forces right now, our special operators in particular, and see the retention and recruiting problems that we have, and not look inward at ourselves and go, my God, this is the result of a moral injury? And I think we really need to talk about this. And the biggest problem I have with this, Fran, it is an injury on the soul. In a way, it's one of the worst kinds of injuries because you never get over it unless there is a communal, collective effort to help people get through it. And leaders are key to that. And where I see a real deficit of leadership right now, from our military leaders in particular, is the absence in the public space talking about this moral injury to our people, and also to Congress and other leaders about increases in mental health capacity and whatever else is needed to address this problem. And most importantly, to reduce this systemic problem of abandonment that we all see and know, and that we're never going to fully get over this until we have assurances that it's fixed.
I want to talk about the recommendations that you made, because you've made a couple of recommendations as to where we go from here. I had the opportunity, the episode just released here in the last week, to interview a parolee, an Afghan parolee. Her name's Asma Pajir.
Okay.
And Al Buford from Patriot Group International has brought her into his family. She's now, she was one of 150 schoolgirls who was evacuated off the airport on one of the C-17s, and now she's at Virginia Tech.
Great.
And trying to help her and raise some money for her to be able to continue her education, because she had a very profound statement that she's a young woman, very impressive young woman, And very rarely in interviews do I become speechless. But she said to me, I don't want to survive. I want to live. And she said that her ability to complete her education is how she will defeat the Taliban. And if she can't complete her education, that achieves the Taliban's intent, was to deny her the opportunity to go to school.
Wow.
You said that the focus must remain on the people of Afghanistan and not what the Taliban can get at their expense, at the expense of the people, including recognition. And you've provided these 3 recommendations. The first one is work with the UN to establish a humanitarian corridor to allow aid to flow in and at-risk Afghans to flow out.
Yeah, man. I mean, like, if you, at night in this city, I bet you see some Ukraine flags. When I went to my wife's birthday thing at the beach just this past weekend, they did a little tap ceremony at the beach and a flag retreat. Before they did that, the veteran said, let's have a moment of silence for the people in Ukraine. You know who you never hear a moment of silence for, or the flags for? The Afghan people.
The Afghans.
We partnered with them for 20 years, right? Whatever narratives are out there about them fighting or quitting, like, those are false narratives. They did what they had to do to survive, what most of us would do to protect their families. Many of them are still fighting and resisting. But frankly, I think the international community has done a disservice to the Afghan people. We have all stuck our head in the sand. It's like the Germans talk about it, when the trains would come by with the Jews on them, they would sing in their churches louder so they wouldn't hear the screams of the Jews on the trains going to the death camps. And to me, it feels like that as an international community and as a nation, that we're singing louder so that we don't hear the screams and the absence of humanity that's happening with women who are subjected to brutality, to commandos who are being hunted and killed in front of their families, to kids that are being deprived the rights to just go to school. I mean, these are things that we've always insisted upon as a nation, as an international community. Why are we turning a blind eye to one of the greatest humanitarian disasters in modern history? Like, it makes no sense. Where are the corridors that would protect these people? Where are the UN interventions? Where are, just on the women's rights issues alone? So, yeah, I think that there has to be a greater focus internationally and nationally on dealing with this humanitarian issue that is Afghanistan. And at a national policy level, why don't we give at least the same tacit level of support to the Afghan resistance that we're giving to the Ukrainian resistance? Makes no sense.
Your second recommendation is to create a special parole program that bypasses the legislation and bureaucracy to allow for the immediate evacuation of those most at risk. I mean, people have been in this SIV program for years.
Yeah.
And it hasn't gone anywhere.
No, and look, that alone is probably going to take 18 years to evacuate the people that an explicit promise was made to. But the implicit moral promise that was made to our partners. See, here's the thing. Afghan commandos, Afghan special forces, the Special Mission Wing, they're not eligible technically for SIV because they worked for the Afghan government. The barber on Bagram is eligible. Now, that's nothing against the barber on Bagram, but who really held the line here for freedom? So the most at-risk community members, particularly our special operations partners, they really have no pathway right now. There's no options for them. And we need to look at, State Department could do this right now. Congress could mandate this. The Biden administration could put this in place. But we need a pathway for humanitarian parole for the most at-risk, particularly Afghan special operators, and get them the heck out of there right now. Most of them would probably go back and fight if they could just get their families to safety.
Yeah. The third one is leverage the aid networks established by the U.S. veteran and volunteer groups.
The private-public relationship that has happened in this whole thing, to me, is really worthy of note. Pineapple was recognized not too long ago by a society that really fosters privatized efforts in the United States. And I thought that was very interesting. I never had really sat down and thought about the private efforts of these groups like Dunkirk, Moral Compass, AFC Free. And what it really came down to, Fran, was all of us, we filled a gap that emerged from this chaos where all of these warriors holding the line at HKIA were looking at a sea of faces, and they weren't really sure who was who. How could they be? But yet we knew who they were, we knew where they were, and they trusted us to deliver them responsibly to certain 4-foot holes in the wire and be pulled through.
Yeah.
And that, to me, was a value proposition that the private sector filled very quickly. Then you look at the Ukraine situation where groups emerged in Ukraine 10x faster because of the work that they had done in Afghanistan. And I think as we look at this humanitarian problem, I think as we look at the resettlement problem here in the United States where these big agencies are overwhelmed, what our private volunteer groups are doing is astounding. One of our shepherds, Ish, is an Afghan American SIV recipient who was Jim Gant's interpreter. Right now, he's running a nonprofit out in the northwest of the United States with Vietnamese refugees who are combining efforts because the Vietnamese understand what it was like to come over here, and they're helping the Afghan refugees sponsor and bring Afghans over here and resettle. And I just think, man, at the end of my book, I ask, what's your Pineapple Express? I think that for our country, if we're going to make the upswing into better days that we need to make, Pineapple, helping Afghans escape was our Pineapple Express. But I think that there needs to be a citizen mobilization like that across a whole lot of fronts. And I think it starts with just recognizing that nobody's coming and stepping into the gap and leading as best you can.
This is an interesting one, though, with respect to this topic, because when you look at public-private partnership, I mean, you look at the COVID vaccine. There's an example of where public-private partnership has resulted in the vaccine being produced so quickly. I mean, we see it in industry. You see it in technology. You see it in IT technology. And then then you come into here, and there is a part of the book where you talk about recognition.
I do, because
and they don't want to bring it up.
And it's not like we want a pat on the back. We're all veterans for the most part. We know we've had the lack of recognition, and we've had the recognition, and we know that comes and goes. And really, that's a booby prize if that's why you're doing what you're doing. It's hollow. But I do believe that the recognition from Congress, the recognition from the Biden administration, the recognition from the State Department and DOD to those active duty operators that did what they did, like John and Jesse and JP, but also to the veterans groups who have cashed in their kids' college funds, who have used their pensions, who have paid for safe houses and babies to be born and medical care through these reverse engineered unconventional warfare networks that they've managed for a year, to not recognize them, for the president to not recognize them in the State of the Union. And then on top of the moral, it just adds fuel to the flame of the moral injury they're already incurring. They've been on a 911 call for a year. They've sustained heavy moral injuries, and now there's not even recognition by the government on the role that they played that was critical. And to me, how hard is that?
Let's talk about the mental health aspect of this thing for a few minutes.
Sure.
2,465 U.S. service members lost. The number of NATO lives lost was 1,144.
Yeah.
So many have been left asking the question of, was it worth it? What did we achieve? We've talked about, you personally have talked about the 23 people close to you that you've lost. There's been, as you said, quote, a palpable spike in veteran mental health incidents following the Afghan collapse, which still continues today, unquote. It's been a trigger for so many people. I mean, I mentioned the 13 that were lost and just I'll never forget standing at the kitchen table and being sick.
Yeah.
And just, and I too have lost many friends in Afghanistan. And a guy who saved my life, I lost in Afghanistan. In Iraq, I was with him, and then he subsequently went to Afghanistan, and he got a Bronze Star for saving me.
Right.
And he was lost in an IED, and on my birthday, years later, and I remember waking up and seeing it and just being a disaster.
Yeah.
And still, I've given talks about him just because that's how we are impacted by these things.
Yeah.
But you've struggled with your own mental health challenges, and you've talked about the battles that you've faced,
right?
And standing in your closet and feeling that today's my last day, and really crediting your son coming home early from school, being one of the only reasons we're sitting here today, possibly.
Yeah.
You wrote the play Last Out to talk about a lot of this and give veterans this perspective through the lens of other veterans, which I think is really unique. Talk for me a bit about your approach to mental health. How do we reconcile this now a year later? How do we come together as a community? Because we've seen how strong this community is when it's activated.
Absolutely.
And I got a call during this from general that I worked for, and he said, I need you to come to DC. And I said, to do what? And he said, don't ask me any questions, get in the car. And I walked in the kitchen, I looked at my wife, and I said, I got to go to DC. The general called. I've been out for 6 years.
Yeah.
And I looked at her, she looked at me, and she said, well, you better go pack a bag.
Right.
Didn't even ask why.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's how this community activates.
Right.
Now, how do we activate around helping each other in mental health?
I think we've got to kind of get over ourselves. We all made a lot of mistakes in the Afghanistan campaign. None of us are absolved of that. I made mistakes. There were a lot of mistakes I made, but I think we got to move on. And we've got to, I've said this to a couple of the general officers who weren't crazy about that book because, their legacy's a little bit, questioned in that book. And that was not my intent. But the thing is, I think we've got to get to a point where we look where we're going now, and we look at the mental health issues facing our troops and our veterans. And here's the thing: when 73% of the veteran population say they feel betrayed from this abandonment, 67% feel humiliated. Then you couple that with 30,177 suicides of active duty and post 9/11. Not even counting Vietnam, compared to 7,000 plus KIA in the war on terror. I mean, those are combat casualties. Those are combat deaths. And that was most of those in the last 3 years. It's been really bad. Those numbers of betrayal and humiliation, what's that going to do? Where's that going to take us? And for us as leaders, we have a moral obligation now to look at this and go, we have a crisis on our hands. Our people, our veterans, are losing trust and faith in our senior leaders, and they're pulling back. They're no longer our moral compass the way they used to be. They're pulling back, and they're isolating, and we cannot allow that to happen. I found that for me, storytelling and connecting through narrative is a powerful way, one way to overcome that. It helped me get out of my depression, my near bout with suicide. And that's why I wrote Last Out, because what I wanted was to tell the story from the stage with veterans and military family members that helped civilians understand the cost of modern war, because I wrote it for civilians actually, but also validated and held space for military families, Gold Star families, and veterans to heal and process their own life through the safety of storytelling. And the fact of the matter is, Fran, societies have been using storytelling to bring warriors home and re-assimilate into society for thousands of years. We're one of the few societies that doesn't. We don't talk about it. We're the quiet professionals. Well, that's great, but what ends up happening is that silence turns into isolation. And if you're not connected to your narrative, you lose your purpose, your identity. Soon you lose yourself. And we've got to find a way to connect. And that's what Last Out's all about. That's why we have it on tour. That's why it's a film, is because I want civilians, I believe, are going to have to help us redistribute this load, this emotional load that so few of our society's carrying, but it's heavy. And storytelling and the play and other forms of narrative exchange can help do that. The final thing I'll say on this is that same study that quotes 73% feeling betrayed, an overwhelming majority of veterans and civilians believe that events that are community-based and narrative in nature are far more useful for reassimilation than parades and ceremonies. And I think we need to be thinking about that. We need to sit together, we need to exchange the stories, and we need to just lean in together and heal through connection.
Well, you said that you interpret, you mean anybody, interprets what you're seeing through your own inner lens.
Yeah, it's called autobiographical listening, and storytelling is that's why it works so well. That's why it's 70,000 years old, is if I sit down with you 10,000 years ago and I talk about why saber-toothed tigers make crappy pets and I'm all bloodied up, you're going to listen like your life depends on it, because you'll autobiographically listen and locate yourself in that story, and it's as if you lived the experience yourself. That's why we love storytellers. That's why we love stories. And I believe that's where we need to go in a lot of ways with this healing, is through narrative exchanges and finding ways to connect civilians, politicians, leaders, and veterans, and Gold Star families, and military families in a room and exchange stories and get a shared perspective on this thing that's not just war, but the abandonment, the withdrawal, all of it. We got to talk about it in a way that's open and healthy. And right now, we're just turning the page like it never even happened.
Yeah.
And that's a very dangerous proposition based on the numbers I'm seeing of how veterans feel about this.
Yeah. No, I agree with you on the storytelling piece too. I mean, getting out there and talking about the things that you're passionate about. I mean, I started this thing called the Jedburgh podcast.
Right.
I mean, that's been my outlet. That's been where I looked around and I said, how am I going to begin to express myself, talk about what I care about, tell stories of others through this lens that has shaped me over a 13-year
Absolutely.
career.
That's why at the end of the book I say, what's your Pineapple Express? Getting Afghans out was ours, but what's yours? I mean, if that's metaphorical for when you look at the arena where something is broken, you look around, nobody else is coming. How are you going to step in and lead? And you're going to feel like you're over your skis. You're going to feel like you're underqualified to do it. You're going to feel like you're not the right person. That's been my life, probably yours too. But the reality is that's exactly what the country needs right now. And frankly, institutional leaders need to see that. We need to model that for them. And if they can't replicate it, we need to replace them with, fair elections and whatever else we need to do. But we need leaders that are doing that kind of work, who are going, okay, what's my Pineapple Express? What do I need to do to play a bigger game? Because otherwise, we're just going to keep going down this same rabbit hole.
And your work with the hero's journey is allowing veterans in transition to do that.
Yeah.
By working with them to actually craft their narrative, tell their story.
We run story workshops. We're working with the Gary Sinise Foundation right now. In fact, we run story exchanges where you exchange stories with other veterans and civilians. We run narrative competence workshops where we teach you how to use storytelling and active listening to build rapport in job interviews and talking to your teenagers. And then we have another one called Take the Mic, where we train veteran influencers. Because I'm an actor, a negotiator, a keynote speaker, and I've spent the last 10 years developing my craft and my instrument as an influencer from the stage. So I love training other speakers how to do that, how to take the mic and own a room. And I think the more our veterans and military family members and first responders do that, people are hungry for it, man. People are hungry for veterans who have been scuffed up to walk in a room and tell their story and own that room through relevance and relatability. It makes us feel safer. It makes us feel like we're being led, and it makes us feel connected. And that's what we focus on at the Hero's Journey, is helping veterans find their voice, their purpose, their point of view, and then tell their story powerfully from the stage or just one-on-one.
And being authentic.
And being authentic. It has to be authentic. Storytelling, by definition, is authentic. Otherwise, it's a speech.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, but that's why you talk about the generosity of scars.
Repurposing one's struggles in the service of others. That's the most generous thing I think we can do as leaders, is if we can take the stuff that scuffed us up and put it to work in the service of other people, so that you hold space for them, and in the safety of your narrative, they can locate themselves in your story and see just how relatable you are because you've been where they've been. And all of a sudden, they feel now what's possible for their own life, and autobiographically, they start to make a move on their own. And it's contagious, and we need it bad in this society that we live in. And the generosity of scars is at the epicenter of what we stand for at the Hero's Journey.
We've talked a lot about rapport building relationships. We've talked a tremendous amount about the operational environment.
Yeah.
And where we sit today. Your work with Rooftop leadership, I am really inspired by what you're doing there, because you're talking about this high stakes, low trust environment. You referenced it a bit ago. Why do leaders and organizations need to know how to operate in this environment? And maybe you could start by defining what a high stakes, low trust environment is.
Yeah, well, it's almost every engagement that we're in these days is that, because we've created a modern society that is mostly transactional. It's mass technology. It's high tempo. And the stakes are high and failure is not an option, right? So we are constantly living at the edge of the envelope with our cortisol levels in the red, and it's like redlining an engine, and we're actually not designed to do that as human beings. Humans are actually meaning-seeking, emotional, social storytellers who struggle. In other words, we're a mess, right? But at a primal level, that's who we are. We're designed to connect with one another. We're wired to connect with one another. And yet the society that we've built around us is so transactional that nobody's ready to listen to the other person, and we're almost operating in a trance-like state of fear-based behavior all the time. And when you're in a fear-based state, you can't listen, you can't connect, you're in a survival mode. So what we have to do as leaders is we have to recognize that leadership is the management of energy, according to Professor James Clausen. Your own energy and then the energy of those around you. How do you manage the emotional temperature in a room? How do you bring someone from a sympathetic state down to a parasympathetic state where they're in a calm and connect kind of state? That's all those old school interpersonal skills that you and I learned in the Q course in Rob and Sage. The difference was, in Rob and Sage, you either had that instinct or you didn't.
Right.
And if you didn't, you were out.
Yeah, quickly.
Well, it turns out there's a whole body.
Well, they actually never let you in.
They never let you in.
Which then meant you were out.
Right. But there's a whole body of work, a whole area of science around storytelling. There's neuroscience around it, how the brain lights up, active listening, being present, intentional, diaphragmatic breathing while you're preparing to walk in a room. So what I did was I geeked out on that for 10 years after I got out, and I thought, what if I could build a body of work around human connection? What if I could help leaders in these high-stakes, low-trust environments actually apply both art and science in how they connect authentically with other humans so that emotional temperature comes down, reciprocity is strong, and the other party's ready to listen? And I've been doing it for 10 years in almost every industry, and I absolutely love it. And it's what's so cool about it is I get to bring all of the great stories and lessons from our NCOs that taught us so much.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And yet incorporate that art with the science that's the latest science on storytelling, listening, interpersonal dynamics, and combine them. And it's a real skill. It moves the needle from instinct to skill. And that's what rooftop leadership's really all about, is getting leaders to go up on the proverbial rooftop and take a stand like we did in Afghanistan using purpose-based human connection.
Afghanistan's not over. There's still a mission there.
Yeah.
You're still involved with it. You have worked a bit on the Ukraine mission now. What's next?
I'm going to stay involved with Afghanistan. Moral Compass is a group I belong to now. It's an informal federation of volunteer groups, mostly special operations types who are working commandos. I'm going to focus on, obviously the book and being an advocate and a storyteller. My ground game days are pretty much over. I'm sponsoring a few people, but I'm not as good at that as a lot of the other younger guys are. But I am pretty good at raising money. I'm pretty good at engaging at a high level. I'm pretty good at telling the story. And that's where I'm going to put my efforts for the rest of my days. I'm never going to quit on our Afghan partners. I believe a resistance is coming. I believe for anybody listening to this, if you're struggling with what was it all for, why did it matter, I don't think it's over yet. I think that the 8 million young men and women who received educations because of what our veterans preserved and fought for, I believe the commandos, the special forces, the KKA, the NMRG, I believe they're gonna make a stand. I really do. And I've talked to a lot of people who, in fact, in many ways, it's already happening. And you know what? There's a chance that Afghanistan finds its way without us. Wouldn't that be a novel idea? It would be helpful if we supported them. But my prayer is that they'll find their way, and that what we did there held space long enough for them to realize it in this new manifestation. And I believe that it was. I believe that it was enough. And I think that we haven't seen the last of the Afghan people standing up for themselves.
Scott, as we close out, the Jedburghs in World War II had to do 3 things as core foundational tasks. Call them habits, if you will. I call them foundations. They had to be able to shoot, they had to be able to move, they had to be able to communicate. If they did these 3 things with the utmost precision, their focus, their attention could actually be on more complex challenges that came their way. What are the 3 things that you do every day to set the conditions for success in your world?
First of all, that's an awesome question, and I love the way that you tie it to the Jedburghs. I mean, that's humbling in and of itself. I could just kind of sit in that for a few minutes. But for me, and like this was true for me with Pineapple, this was true for me with VSO, this was true with the play. All of the aspects in my life where and by the way, there were plenty more failures than successes, but the strategic outcomes that I was able to achieve in my life through focused application, I believe 3 things were at play: prepare, connect, recover. We're social creatures, so we're actually wired to interact with one another, but most people are so casual about it and semi-conscious about it that they leave tons of social capital on the table, and they don't even know what their goals are when they walk in the room. So preparing for every engagement that you do as if your life depended on it. The way that we do before we go and do a key leader engagement with tribal elders or with an ambassador, right, or a minister of defense, we treat it as if our life depended on it, because in many cases it does. Well, what if we all did that? What if we all, I believe 2/3 of influence come from the preparation before you ever even walk in the room. Even the diaphragmatic breathing you do to get yourself into a parasympathetic state. I have this thing called pre-engagement prep that gets you ready to walk in the room and own the room. So that's number one, prepare it. Connect. With that, I'm talking about really meet the other party where they are, not where you want them to be. Right? That's how we're actually wired, to be an empathetic witness to the other party and really focus on their goals and needs as much as you focus on your own, because reciprocity is a beautiful thing, right? And if you can establish a level of empathy, tactical empathy, reciprocity is likely going to follow. And it costs you nothing in a transactional world to just be a good listener and to insist on seeing the pictures in the other party's head. That's usually the metric I use for connect. Can I see the pictures in the head of the other party? I.e., what's their goal? What's their pain? What's their goal? What's their pain? And until I'm clear on that, I'm in no position to open my mouth for my agenda. And then the final thing is recovery. When we connect and engage in these high stakes, low trust times, the stakes are so high that we're operating in the red all the time. No one's recovering. So you go right from one engagement to the next, and you're in a sympathetic state all the time. And if you don't do little micro recoveries between your engagements, between your connections, then you walk from one engagement into the next already elevated, already emotionally aroused at such a level that the party smells you when you come in, and they know something's up. At the end of the day, people aren't doing any kind of breathing. They're not putting their phones up. They're not letting their body recover, drop into a parasympathetic state where they can, the body knows how to unwind. It knows how to metabolize the stress and the tension that come from engagements. But you got to give it a chance to do that, whether that's working out, walking with your spouse, playing with your kids, or just sitting in a quiet room and breathing. It's not, getting a gin and tonic and watching Game of Thrones, right? The body, because that's engaging. Yeah. Body actually needs to drop into that parasympathetic state. So I think those at a high level are the 3 things that I try to do every single day of my life: prepare, connect, recover, and just rinse and repeat.
I love it. Those 3 are amazing. We'll be pushing that message out, because I think that when we talk about high performance of individuals, of teams, of organizations, we tie a lot of these conversations into these 9 characteristics of performance that Special Operations Command has used since the time of the Jedburghs. Yeah. Drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, curiosity, team ability, effective intelligence, emotional strength. But all of those are required when you really talk about what we've defined as Jedburghs. Yeah. What I've said on this podcast are visionaries, drivers of change, those dedicated to winning no matter the challenge. It started with the Jedburghs. It's been defined by SOF. It's how we feel when we achieve our motto as Green Berets: free the oppressed.
That's right.
De oppresso liber. The situation in Afghanistan, as we talked about for the last hour and a half or so, has been in so many ways, and as you quoted in the book, did we oppress the liberated? And we have to ask ourselves these questions. But I want to end on a quote that you have from the book, because I think it's really important. And it says, "Veterans and civilian volunteers honored a promise and demonstrated what leadership looked like. Operation Pineapple Express tells the story of a group of friends who honored a promise to Afghanistan when others did not. For a fleeting moment, They defined what America could be once again. We sit here on this terrace overlooking what we've named the Freedom Tower.
Yeah.
The reflecting pools. What was 21 years ago now, in another week or two, was ground zero of one of the most horrific attacks that the world has ever seen. America, as defined by our former president, is the shining city on the hill.
Yeah.
And it requires leadership. It requires people to come down here and look at this and say, I'll protect this no matter what.
Right.
No matter the challenge.
Yeah.
And I'll find a way to do that. The Afghans call that a brother of quality.
That's right.
In order to know what a brother of quality is, you'll have to go read the book, because I'm not going to have you define it here. But, Scott, you've defined brother of quality.
Thank you so much, Fran.
You've shown all of us in the regiment and the world what true leadership looks like. I thank you so much for spending this day with me here in New York. I know you got a lot of things going on, but there's no better place than I can imagine to be right now and sitting here talking to you. And I appreciate everything you're doing. And
thank you so much, man. I appreciate it. Thank you.
American Jedburghs went out to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Director to the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh Podcast. I'm your creator and host, Fran Racioppi. Join us next week for a new episode on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out on YouTube for full episodes, highlights, and other behind-the-scenes content. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, Talent War Group, and our sponsor Jersey Mike Subs on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Send your comments and inquiries to media@talentwargroup.com. As former members of Special Operations Forces, the Jedburgh Podcast and Talent War Group contribute a percentage of all profits to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, supporting the families of our fallen warriors. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.